There are certain moments when fear doesn't arrive all at once. It starts with something so small that you almost feel ridiculous for noticing it. A light turning on in a room you just left. A stranger mentioning a detail you never told them. Or a message appearing on your phone from someone who shouldn't even know you're there. The terrifying part isn't realizing that someone is watching you. It's realizing they've been watching you for much longer than you thought. Tonight, 3 people discover that the safest places in their lives weren't nearly as private as they believed. And by the time they understood what was happening, someone else already knew their routines. Story 1. The stranger who learned my routine. The first message arrived at 6:14 in the morning. It said, "You forgot your umbrella again." I remember staring at those 6 words for almost a full minute. Not because I was scared yet, because I was confused. It hadn't been raining, I hadn't forgotten an umbrella, and the person who sent the message wasn't saved in my contacts. I lived alone, in a small apartment above a row of businesses, in a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. My building wasn't particularly secure, but I had never considered that a serious problem. The front entrance locked automatically. My apartment had a deadbolt, there were cameras in the parking lot, and most importantly, I wasn't the kind of person who thought strangers paid attention to me. At the time, I was 22 and working mornings at a coffee shop across town. My schedule was boringly predictable. I left my apartment at 5:40 every morning. I stopped at the same gas station, I parked behind the coffee shop. I worked until early afternoon. Then I usually went home. There was nothing interesting about my life. At least that's what I thought. The message came from an account with no profile picture. I opened it again. "You forgot your umbrella again." I typed, "Who is this?" The account didn't answer. Instead, another message arrived. "You look tired today." That was when I felt the first real chill. Because I hadn't gone to work yet. I was still sitting on the edge of my bed. I hadn't even changed out of my pajamas. I looked toward the window. The blinds were closed. I checked the front door. Locked. Then I walked through the apartment, checking every room, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. Nothing. I went back to my phone. The account had disappeared. I couldn't find it in my messages anymore. I convinced myself it had been some kind of mistake. Maybe the person had sent the message to the wrong account. Maybe they were talking about somebody else. I went to work. By lunchtime, I'd forgotten about it. Then, at 1:06 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was the same account. This time the message said, "Blue jacket today, better than yesterday." I stopped walking. I was wearing a blue jacket. I looked around the parking lot. There were employees leaving the building, cars coming and going, and people walking along the sidewalk. Nobody appeared to be looking at me. I immediately went back inside. I showed the message to my coworker, Maya. She laughed nervously. She asked if I'd been talking to someone online. I told her no. She suggested blocking the account. So I did. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the next morning, I found a folded piece of paper underneath my windshield wiper. There was no writing on the outside. Inside were 3 words. Wrong parking space. I stood beside my car without touching it. My stomach tightened. I looked around. The parking lot was nearly empty. My car was parked exactly where I always parked. Except that morning, I'd arrived late. There had been a delivery truck in my usual spot, so I'd parked closer to the opposite side of the building. Nobody should have known that. I took a photograph of the note and called the police. An officer came by later that afternoon. He looked at the note, asked if I'd had problems with anyone. I said no. He asked whether I had an ex. I said no. He asked whether anyone at work might be joking around. Again, no. He told me to keep the note and document anything else. Then he left. I felt embarrassed. I almost wished I hadn't called. For the next few days, nothing happened. No messages, no notes, no strange calls. I started relaxing. Then, Friday came. I finished work at 2 p.m. and stopped at a supermarket on my way home. I walked through the automatic doors. I grabbed a basket. I bought milk, cereal, pasta, and a frozen pizza. Nothing unusual. I was standing in the checkout line when a man behind me said, "Long day?" I turned around. He was probably in his 30s, gray hoodie, baseball cap, Nothing particularly threatening about him. I smiled politely. Yeah, he looked at the items in my basket. Pizza night? I laughed awkwardly. Apparently, he nodded. Then he said, "You always buy the same one." I froze. What? He smiled. The pizza. I looked down at the basket, then back at him. He was already looking away. I paid and left. I sat in my car for several minutes. I didn't start the engine. I kept replaying the conversation. Maybe he meant the brand. Maybe he'd seen me shopping before. Maybe I was overreacting. Then I noticed something on the passenger seat. A folded paper. My hands went cold. I picked it up. There were 4 words. "You should change stores." I drove directly to the police station. This time, they took me seriously. They asked for the previous note. They photographed both. They asked whether I knew the man at the supermarket. I didn't. They told me to avoid predictable routines. I changed my route. I started shopping at different stores. I stopped going to the same gas station. I stopped parking in the same place. And for almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. I thought maybe it had worked. Then one night, I came home around 9:30. As I approached my building, I noticed the light above the entrance was off. It was normally motion activated. I walked closer. The door opened automatically. I stepped inside. Then I heard footsteps above me, slow footsteps, 1 floor up. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I waited. Nothing. I climbed the stairs. The hallway was empty. I reached my apartment. My deadbolt was still locked. Everything looked normal. I went inside. I turned on the lights. Nothing seemed wrong. Then, I noticed my kitchen chair. It was pulled away from the table. I always pushed it completely underneath. I stood there staring at it. Then, I noticed the bedroom door. It was open. I always slept with it closed. I called the police again. They searched the apartment. Nothing. No broken windows, no damaged locks, no obvious signs of entry. The officer told me it could have been something I did without remembering. I wanted to believe him. Then, he noticed something I hadn't. The bathroom window. It was unlocked. It opened onto the fire escape. The officer checked the fire escape. There were fresh, wet footprints on the metal steps. Someone had been standing outside my apartment. That night, I didn't sleep there. I stayed with Maya. The following morning, I changed the locks. I also installed a small camera facing my front door. For 3 nights, nothing happened. On the 4th night, at 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the camera. Motion detected. I opened the app. At first, I saw only the empty hallway. Then a figure slowly stepped into frame. The person was wearing a dark hoodie. Their face was covered. They stood directly outside my apartment. They didn't knock. They didn't try the door. They simply stood there for almost 40 seconds. Then they leaned toward the camera and lifted one finger to their lips. The video ended. I called the police. They arrived within minutes. But the hallway was empty. The camera showed no other movement. The officers searched the stairwell, roof access, and fire escape. Nobody was there. Then one officer asked me something. "Did you tell anyone about the camera?" I said no. He looked at the recording again. Then he asked, "Did you post anything online tonight?" I hadn't, but Maya had. She had posted a picture earlier that evening. It showed us eating dinner. In the background was the restaurant window, and reflected in that window was my car. The location wasn't tagged, but the restaurant was only 3 blocks from my apartment. Someone had been following me. The police eventually identified a man who had been seen repeatedly near my workplace and apartment. He was questioned, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. I moved a month later. I changed my phone number. I deleted my public social media accounts. And I stopped following routines that had once seemed harmless. I still think about that first message. "You forgot your umbrella again." Because I never did. There was something else that bothered me even more. The morning that message arrived, my umbrella was sitting beside my front door, exactly where I'd left it. Which means whoever sent that message wasn't telling me something they had seen me do. They were trying to make me believe they were close enough to see everything. And I still don't know whether they were. Story 2. The man waiting outside. The strangest thing about the man was that he never tried to approach me. He simply waited. The first time I saw him, he was standing beside a closed laundromat at the end of my street. It was almost midnight. I was driving home from my brother's house. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the businesses were closed. The streetlights were spaced far enough apart that entire sections of the sidewalk disappeared into darkness. I noticed him because he wasn't moving. He stood beneath a broken streetlight wearing a dark coat. No phone, no cigarette, no bicycle, nothing. Just standing there. I slowed down as I passed. His head turned toward my car. I kept driving. When I reached my house, I parked in the driveway. I got out. I looked back toward the road. He was gone. I told myself he'd simply walked away. I locked the front door and went upstairs. Nothing happened. The following night, I saw him again. Same street, same time. Different location. This time, he was standing beside a bus shelter nearly half a mile away. I recognized the coat. I recognized the way he stood. Completely still. I didn't stop. I drove home. That night, I locked every door. The next morning, I told my brother. He said it was probably someone waiting for a late bus. I wanted to believe that. A week passed. Then, on a Thursday night, I was driving home again. As I turned onto my street, I saw the man. He wasn't standing near the laundromat. He wasn't at the bus shelter. He was standing directly beside my driveway. I almost drove past my house. Instead, I continued around the block. I parked behind a convenience store and waited. After 10 minutes, I drove back. He was gone. I called my brother and asked him to stay on the phone while I went inside. He did. I pulled into my driveway, got out, ran to the front door, unlocked it, went inside, then I locked it behind me. I stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no knocking, no sound. I went upstairs. My bedroom window faced the driveway. I closed the curtains. I didn't sleep much that night. The next evening, I decided to stay at my brother's house. Before leaving, I checked every window. Everything was locked. I left around 6 p.m. At 11:30, my phone received a notification from the security camera. Motion detected. I opened the app. The driveway was empty. Then the camera shifted slightly. A man stepped into frame. He walked directly toward my front door. He stopped. He looked at the camera. Then he raised his hand. For a second, I thought he was waving. He wasn't. He was pointing at the camera. Then he walked away. I called the police. They arrived at my house. The man was gone. The officer checked the camera. He asked if I knew him. I said no. They searched around the property. Nothing. The officer told me to stay somewhere else for the night. So I did. The next morning I returned home. There was a piece of cardboard wedged underneath my front door. I pulled it out. On it was a handwritten sentence. "You weren't home." I called the police again. This time, they checked the neighborhood cameras. They found him. He had been appearing near my house for several days. But there was something strange. He wasn't following me. He was waiting for me to leave. Every time I drove away, he disappeared. Every time I came home, he returned. It looked like he was studying my routine. I stopped going home directly after work. I stayed with friends. I changed the times I left. I started taking different roads. For nearly 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then, one evening, I came home unexpectedly. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't posted online. I simply decided to return earlier than usual. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw the man's coat hanging over the fence, but the man wasn't there. I got out of the car. I walked toward the front door. Then I heard something. A faint metallic sound from behind the house. I stopped. It sounded like someone moving the handle of the back gate. I called the police. Then I walked back into my car and locked the doors. 3 minutes later, an officer arrived. They searched the backyard. Nobody. But they found something. A small folding chair had been placed behind the shed. It was positioned so someone sitting there could see directly into my bedroom window. The officer asked how long I'd lived there. Almost 3 years. He looked at the chair, then at the window. He said this wasn't placed here tonight. There were leaves underneath it, meaning whoever had been sitting there had been returning for a while. I moved out. I never found out who the man was. But several months later, I received a letter at my new address. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed my old house, taken from across the street. The photograph had been taken at night. My bedroom light was on, and written on the back were 5 words. You should close your curtains. I still had the photograph for years. Eventually, I threw it away, but I never again leave a window uncovered at night. Because sometimes the person outside doesn't need to break in. Sometimes all they want is to know that you know they're there. Tori, 3 o'clock. Someone had a key. For nearly 6 months, I thought I was losing my mind. Things kept moving inside my apartment. Not disappearing, not breaking, moving. A mug I'd left beside the sink would appear on the coffee table. A cabinet I'd closed would be open. The thermostat would be different. The curtains would be pulled back. At first, I blamed myself. I lived alone. I worked long shifts. I was tired. It was easy to imagine I'd simply forgotten. Then I started finding things that couldn't be explained that way. One morning, I woke up and found my front door unlocked. I was certain I'd locked it. I always check twice before going to bed. I checked the door, the deadbolt was turned, but the main latch wasn't engaged. I thought maybe I'd accidentally forgotten. So, I started photographing the lock every night before bed. Locked. Photograph. Sleep. The next morning, the door was sometimes exactly as I'd left it. Other mornings, it wasn't. Then things began disappearing. A pair of headphones. A jacket. A small amount of cash. Nothing valuable enough to immediately notice. It was almost as if someone was taking random objects just to prove they could. I called my landlord. He said there was no reason for anyone to enter my apartment. I believed him. For a while. One afternoon, I came home from work and found my kitchen window open. I lived on the 3rd floor. Nobody could realistically climb through it. I closed it, locked it. Then I checked the rest of the apartment. Nothing. That night, I placed a glass against the front door. If someone opened it, the glass would fall. The next morning, the glass was still standing. But the door was unlocked. I started getting scared. I told my friend. He suggested installing a camera. So I bought a cheap indoor security camera and placed it facing the entrance. For the first few days, nothing happened. Then, one morning, I checked the footage. At 3:41 a.m., the camera had stopped recording. At 3:48, it resumed. 7 minutes were missing. I checked the power. The camera had never lost electricity. I checked the internet. It had been connected. Someone had manually disconnected it. I called the landlord again. He insisted nobody had entered. Then I noticed something. There was a small maintenance panel inside the hallway closet. I'd never opened it. I did. Behind it was a narrow cavity containing pipes and electrical wiring. And tucked into the back was an old key. I assumed it was a spare. I asked the landlord. He said he didn't know it was there. That answer frightened me more than anything else. I began searching the apartment. I found another panel behind the washing machine, another narrow access point. It connected to the maintenance corridor behind several apartments. I had never known it existed. The landlord claimed it was sealed, but the screws looked new. I called the police. They inspected the corridor. They found fresh footprints. Then, they found something worse. A blanket, a flashlight, several empty water bottles, and a small notebook. The notebook contained dates, my work schedule, the times I left, the times I returned. Even the days I ordered food, someone had been tracking me, but there was no one there. The police told me to stay somewhere else. I did, for 2 weeks. Then the landlord changed the locks. I thought it was over. I moved back. For a while, nothing happened. Then, one morning, I found a note inside my mailbox. It said, "You made this difficult." I immediately called the police. They searched the building. Nothing. I asked the landlord about the maintenance corridor again. He became defensive. He said the building had been under renovation years earlier. Several workers had possessed master keys. That didn't explain the notebook. Or the missing 7 minutes. I bought another camera. This time, I installed 2. one facing the front door, one facing the hallway closet. 3 nights later, I finally got the footage I needed. At 2:52 a.m., the closet door opened. Slowly, a man's hand appeared, then his shoulder, then his face. He stepped into the apartment. He wasn't wearing a mask. He looked completely comfortable, like he belonged there. He walked into my kitchen, opened the refrigerator, took a bottle of water. Then he stood there for almost a minute, looking around. Finally, he walked toward my bedroom. The footage ended. I couldn't breathe. The police watched it. They recognized him. He was a former maintenance employee. He had worked at the building years earlier. The landlord claimed he'd been fired. But apparently, his old master key had never been recovered. The police searched his current residence. They found several items that had disappeared from my apartment. But there was something else. A box containing photographs. Photographs of different tenants. Taken through windows. Taken from parking lots. Taken from hallways. Some were years old. I was one of dozens. The man had apparently been using maintenance access points to enter apartments when residents were gone. He wasn't stealing much. He was watching people. The police arrested him. I moved immediately. Months later, I received a call from the detective handling the case. He told me something that I still think about. They had found a second notebook. It contained notes about my apartments. One line was circled repeatedly. It said, "She almost noticed." The detective asked whether I remembered anything unusual from the months before the first break-in. I said no. Then I remembered something. About 3 months before everything started, I'd been sick. I stayed home from work for several days. One afternoon, I was lying on the couch when I heard the front door unlock. I assumed it was my landlord. I called out. Nobody answered. I walked toward the hallway. The door was already closed. I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. I'd completely forgotten about that moment, until the detective asked. The man had probably already been inside my apartment by then. He knew when I was home, he knew when I was gone, he knew where I slept. And for months, I had been blaming myself for things that weren't my fault. The worst part isn't knowing that someone entered my apartment. It's knowing that while I was sleeping, I had no idea how close he was. Even now, I still check locks twice. I check closets, I check windows, and whenever I stay somewhere unfamiliar, I look for doors and panels that shouldn't be there. Because I learned something I wish I hadn't. A locked door only protects you if you're the only person who has the key. 3 different people, 3 different situations, and 3 completely different kinds of danger. But there was one thing connecting all of them. The warning signs were there. A strange message, a person waiting outside, a door that shouldn't have been open, a detail that only someone watching could have known. The frightening part is that none of these moments looked important at first. That's how real fear often begins. Not with screaming, not with someone breaking through a window. It begins with something small that doesn't make sense. And sometimes, the safest thing you can do is stop telling yourself that you're imagining it. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to patterns, and if something feels wrong, don't wait until you have undeniable proof before protecting yourself. Because by the time you understand that someone has been watching you, they may already know far more about you than you know about them. If these stories kept you looking over your shoulder, subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Because the next story might begin with something even more ordinary and end somewhere you never expected.